Welcome to our webinar, Preparing for Faithful Nonviolent Resistance in the Election Season. My name is Leah Shade, and I am one of the co-founders of the Clergy Emergency League. During this election season and beyond, we are asking, how can we empower ourselves and our congregations for faithful action amidst the rising tides of white Christian nationalism and authoritarianism? The Reverend Lauren Grubaugh Thomas will share time-tested civil resistance strategies, along with theological and biblical frameworks for collective struggle to equip us to contend together for our democracy. I invite you to put your name, location, your congregation or organization, and your role into the chat. And during this webinar, we also invite you to put your questions into the chat as well. Before we introduce our speaker, we want to tell you about the two organizations that are hosting this session. Here is Brianna Elene to tell us about Wisconsin Council of Churches.
Thank you, Leah. We are delighted to be here tonight. The Wisconsin Council of Churches is a network of Christian churches and faith-based organizations committed to working together across our many differences. Exercising holy imagination, we help one another make courageous choices that lead towards peacemaking, social and economic justice for Wisconsin's most vulnerable residents, the vitality of the church, and the well-being of our neighbors. The council connects 21 Christian traditions, which have within them approximately 2,000 congregations and over 1 million church members. But though we are focused in Wisconsin, our resources extend well beyond Wisconsin to serve faith communities throughout the United States, including things like the webinars we're doing tonight. And now, Leah, can you tell us about the Clergy Emergency League and introduce our speaker?
Absolutely. We started the Clergy Emergency League in June of 2020, and we are a grassroots network of more than 2,600 clergy across the United States. I'll put a link to our organization into the chat. We provide support, accountability, resources, and networking for clergy to prophetically minister in their congregations and the public square during this time of political upheaval, social unrest, and partisan division. You can visit our website at clergyemergencyleague.org. And if you are a clergy member, you can join our Facebook group. I'll put that into the chat as well. We are very excited to partner with Wisconsin Council of Churches on this webinar series. And I want to share with you what we have done so far and the one webinar that we have coming up. So I'm going to do a quick screen share here. On September 17th, I did a webinar on discovering your congregation's theologies of conflict during the election season. On October 1st, we had a panel discussing politics, the media, and the church's role in truth-telling during the election season. Tonight, we're going to have preparing for faithful nonviolent resistance in this election season. And in 2 weeks, we have a session on depolarizing congregations and communities during the election season and beyond. The first two webinars are on YouTube. I'll put those links into the chat. This webinar is being recorded and will also be made available. And I'll also put the link for you to register for our last webinar on October 29th. Now I would like to introduce our speaker. The Reverend Lauren Grubaugh Thomas nurtures soulful revolutionaries as a writer, an activist, and church planter in the Episcopal Church in Colorado. She is on the steering committee of the Clergy Emergency League and is a founding member of Palestinian Anglicans and Clergy Allies. She writes and makes podcasts at the intersection of spiritual transformation and social change at her site, A Soulful Revolution. We'll put that information into the chat as well. You can follow her on, is it Twitter, Lauren? At Reverend Lauren G. Thomas. I'll put
Yeah,
that
that's
into the chat.
on Instagram and on Threads.
On Threads.
I'm
Okay,
off the
great.
Twitters.
Off the Twitter. Okay. Reverend Thomas, thank you for joining us for this webinar. I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you have a very engaging PowerPoint for us. And again, folks, as you're watching this, if you have questions, please put them into the chat, because when she's done, we are going to throw your questions to her and engage in a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Leah, and thank you for having me. It's great to be with you and with everybody who's on this webinar this evening. It has been more than 4 years since I joined forces with Clergy Emergency League and became a member of the steering committee, which is hard to believe that we're in this election cycle again. And so I'm here again to bring back some time-tested strategies for nonviolent resistance, rooted in theology, rooted in our scriptures, and in the tradition, the grand tradition of nonviolent resistance throughout history. I've been a student of nonviolent resistance for the last decade, and that has primarily come in concert with my involvement in racial justice efforts, particularly in the aftermath of one of my neighbors, J.R. Thomas, who was a Black man in Pasadena, California, be killed by police in 2016. That was a major catalyzing event for me to join the movement for Black lives. And more recently, these lessons about nonviolent resistance have aided me incredibly in my work for Palestinian advocacy and solidarity, in particular, as Leah alluded to, in my role as a founding member of Palestinian Anglicans and Clergy Allies. And so that's a little bit of my context. And I'm also an Episcopal priest. I've served in parish settings, and I now find myself the church planter of a small community in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. And so these are the ministry contexts where I've sought to implement some of what I'm sharing with you tonight. And so I hope that the examples that I provide will be helpful for you as you're thinking about how you can bring your deep conviction about the justice of God into practical expression within your church community, within your wider community context. So to begin, I want to share one of my favorite stories about nonviolent resistance. And it's really the first example of nonviolent resistance that we find in our scriptures. It's the story of the Hebrew midwives in the first chapter of Exodus, Shiphrah and Puah. I'll read you a little bit of that text. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other named Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" In this text, we see the midwives disobeying Pharaoh's order to act as agents of state violence. And instead, with an act of courageous disobedience, they become faithful actors in God's salvation history. They understand that their ultimate ruler is not the flesh and blood power brokers of this world, but Almighty God, who made all that is out of nothing and out of love. And their courageous non-cooperation reveals the chasm between imperial common sense and the ethics of God's reign. So I start with the story tonight for all of you because this is the story that roots us in where our ethic of nonviolence takes its foundation, which is the worship of God. On the one hand, we have imperial common sense. So we have empires that are striving to convince us that the hierarchy of human worth is the foundation of the world. That there are people who are disposable and there are people whose lives will be preserved by any means necessary. And Shiphrah and Puah's disobedience of Pharaoh disrupts this common sense about human disposability. Their refusal to go along with this unjust law reveals that it is violence that is a departure from a divine ethic of love and of care and of the ensuring of human flourishing. And they don't stop there. I love this next part of the text. They subversively use humor to highlight the dignity of the Hebrew women whom they serve as midwives. The text says, the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. These women refuse to let Hebrew women be portrayed as less than human. And instead, they describe their strength and their power. And if I was Pharaoh in this moment, I would probably be shaking in my boots, because the narrator goes on to build on the strength of the Hebrew women by adding that God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. This example of civil disobedience early in our Bible is about the spiritual fortitude of an oppressed people in the face of mass genocidal violence. Even more than it's about the sheer numbers of those people, it's about their spiritual strength and resolve. And it's the midwives who set a pattern of principled resistance to the oppressive status quo, rooted in their conviction that God's will for God's people is life. I know that it's easy to feel disempowered, to feel helpless in the face of violence. And I often have felt myself teetering on the edge of despair. Perhaps you felt this way as well. And that's the way that the systems of this world, the empires in which we live, that's what they're meant to make us feel. They're built to make us feel helpless, disempowered, and despairing of any change being possible. The sheer volume of violence surrounding us can leave us despairing. And yet the fear of God, above all else, sharpens our moral clarity and strengthens our moral courage. So the question of to whom will you rend your worship is where this presentation begins, and where our call to nonviolence begins in this electoral season and beyond. This is what makes a nonviolent ethic of resistance distinctly Christian. Now, I don't say exclusively Christian because, of course, there's people across religious traditions, as well as people who don't embrace any particular faith at all, who embrace the ethic of nonviolence, either on principle or for purely strategic reasons. But the Christian seeking to embody an ethic of nonviolence begins with a theological foundation. That worship of God, as made known in the person of Jesus Christ, whose very incarnation is an embodied expression of humility, solidarity with the oppressed, and power under constraint for the sake of love, is the root of all of our faithful action. Christian nonviolence is characterized by love of God and love of neighbor, where our neighbors who are marginalized, persecuted, and oppressed receive particular concern, because that's what Jesus modeled. And it's also the biblical witness of faithful people like Shiphrah and Puah. In God's dominion, no one is disposable. When worship of God, as revealed in Christ, is our starting point, it doesn't matter what dynasty of pharaohs might come next. Anyone who demands your allegiance to anyone or anything that is not God must be resisted. So it's important not to let our moral clarity be clouded by those who would speak of themselves as just or democratic or good. The proof is in the pudding. Watch what rulers do, not what they say. Rulers will consistently push the bounds of what is acceptable. There is a creeping effect as violence is normalized. Pay attention to who is being rendered disposable. The status quo currently allows for mass incarceration, climate catastrophe, and genocide. And a nonviolent ethic resists the common sense that any of these forms of ongoing violence is an acceptable cost for your comfort or security. When violence is the prevailing common sense, disobedience is the only faithful way forward. These photos are a few examples of nonviolent resistance that I've participated in the last decade in within some church contexts or church adjacent contexts, I should say. The far left is a subversive liturgy, which was staged on the steps of the Pasadena Police Department for a year in 2016, following the murder of J.R. Thomas by Pasadena police. It was a space of deep lament, a place to pray for justice, a place to join our prayers and our actions together for the sake of justice for Black lives. The middle photo on the top is All Saints Church in Pasadena, which put up this sign during the Muslim ban. You'll recall early in the Trump administration when that was in effect. The photo on the bottom is Lee Curtis, who was formerly the canon at the cathedral in Indianapolis. And this was our Every Family is Holy campaign during the family separation policy under the Trump administration. We elected to put our Holy Family, our nativity scene, in a cage. This is in downtown Indianapolis, and passersby would see this family and wonder why our nativity was in a cage. And our mantra was, it is because every family is holy. Cada familia es sagrada. And just as the Holy Family was forced to flee as refugees under the genocidal violence of Herod, so families at the southern border of this country were being violently separated from one another by the violence of the policy of the former president. And finally, the photo on the right-hand side is two of my colleagues here in Colorado, whom I invited to participate and lead with me a liturgy alongside of students who had formed an encampment in solidarity with Palestinians here at a campus at Metro State in Denver. And so this was a liturgy for the martyrs. So I shared these photos as just a few examples of the ways in which our worship can in fact become one of the ways in which we orient ourselves toward justice, in which we stage resistance to the status quo, and in which our worship inspires our resistance. However, it is not easy to do this, to resist the status quo, to disobey in the midst of oppressive regimes, in the midst of imperial common sense, is a deeply challenging and risky thing. And so it's important to understand why people choose to go along with the status quo, why people obey, when we're preparing ourselves for the possibility of disobedience, for faithful nonviolent resistance to the status quo. So these are a few of the reasons that people obey, and these come from the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies. The first is habit. We grow up being told that we need to obey our parents, our teachers, and other authority figures. Getting out of the habit of doing this is difficult. We have to set new habits for resistance. Self-interest is one reason that people obey. Folks are often rewarded under the status quo with money, with jobs, with social standing. And so finding ways to root in self-interest is always going to be important when we're talking about how to disobey. Fear of sanctions. So this can be physical punishment. There's detention. disappearance, or death. The 3 Ds is what they're sometimes called. But these are all the ways in which people are punished for failing to abide by the status quo. Then we have the zone of indifference. So this is apathy. This is people who want to stay out of trouble, people who say, it's too complicated, I don't want to get involved, I don't have enough information. In a culture of information overload, the zone of indifference is a significant reason in why people choose not to get involved in movements of resistance. Absence of self-confidence. This is the kind of helplessness that people feel, the kind of hopelessness that people feel, the sense that nothing can change because it's been the same way for years and years and years. How could anything change? And so folks will feel a lack of confidence in their ability to bring about positive change. Then we have moral obligation. This one is often aided by religious doctrine. A lot of people will cite Romans for their moral obligation to obey the powers that be. A lot of folks believe that all laws are in place for the protection of everyone, forgetting that, or maybe not even knowing, that folks like Dr. King have taught us that we have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. There's a lot of folks who have a psychological identification with those who are ruling. We see that this oftentimes in terms of racial sense of affiliation and connection. So white people following politicians who are willing to take away their social safety net because they believe that they might one day become rich and powerful themselves, in spite of all evidence to the contrary. Superhuman factors are the idea that people attach a godlike character to the person who is in charge. I saw a T-shirt the other day of the former president looking like a deity. It was almost an iconic image of Trump. And that is this idea of superhuman factors that people ascribe to him or to other people too. And helplessness and hopelessness, I spoke to that, but this idea of being deeply disempowered. And then finally, majority behavior, which is this idea that the pack is going along with it, so it must be good. It must be good and right and neat to do this, to follow this ruler. And the alternative to this is that if the majority starts to provide a brave alternative example, others will go along too. So what can we do practically? I find myself deeply curious, especially over the last few years, about what it might look like to empower ourselves and our communities to discern together what faithful disobedience might look like in our communities. We already create committees to accompany people in their vocational discernment. What might it look like to provide supportive environments for people to discern a faithful justice walk, a faithful nonviolent resistance within their own personal lives and also within our communities? Might we communally discern the ways that we are being called to divest from empire? I've seen some great examples in the last few years of churches that will pay off people's loans. They will pay off predatory high interest loans. And then folks can repay those with zero interest, freeing people up to be able to invest their resources in other ways and to be able to care for themselves and their families. And we can also accompany folks in our wider community in their discernment. I showed the photo of my colleagues at the encampment in Denver this last spring. We can accompany folks like we did these students who are looking for spiritual and theological undergirding for the justice work that they're already doing. But they may need some language, they may need some theological formation to have a better understanding of how to sustain that work, how to root themselves in community in that work. And then finally, I wonder about the accompaniment of individuals. People are deeply isolated right now and may feel that they can't resist the status quo. because it's simply too risky for them. But what if there were groups that could, say, accompany somebody who is deeply troubled about their involvement in the military industrial complex? What if we had a spirituality of resistance director who could accompany someone discerning what it means to potentially step out of that? And then a network of mutual aid to support somebody who might make that decision. So there's lots of ways that we can empower our people and ourselves spiritually and practically to begin to think about disobedience. I want to share another story from this perspective of nonviolent resistance, and it's the story of Vashti. The story of Vashti often gets sidelined by the story of Esther. And of course, Esther, she comes into her role for such a time as this, right? And she's able to advocate for her people in an incredibly powerful way. But before Esther comes Vashti, and she is somebody who begins to wobble the pillars of power, which we'll talk about in a moment, in ways that actually make way for Esther, make possible some greater social disruption. So here's just a bit of her story from the book of Esther. Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. The king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. The king's advisors said to him, "This deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come.' This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath." Vashti is one of our early feminist heroes. Sheroes, I should say. She is somebody who refuses to consent to the objectification of her person, and she doesn't cooperate with the king when he tells her what to do. She refuses to obey, and her disobedience sets in motion an interesting chain of events. The king is immediately concerned, his advisors tell him anyway, that this disobedience that she has exercised has the possibility of making all women in his kingdom refuse to obey their husbands, that they might become these feminist hijackers of the status quo too. And in fact, to some extent, that's what we see. We see the story of Esther, who comes in and advocates for another minoritized community, another oppressed community, the Jewish people, who have been made a marginalized, targeted community within the Assyrian regime. And so this story illustrates for us a key idea within social change theory, which is the social view of power. So we first have to talk about the traditional view of power, which is simply that there is a person in power, there is a ruler, a king, a president who has a tremendous amount of power, and that from them all the power flows down, all these decisions flow down, and we are simply the passive recipients of the power that is enacted upon us. The social view of power says that this is actually flipped. That rather than power flowing down from the top down, power flows up. And so this inverted triangle, these pillars of support, are upheld by all of us cooperating with the systems of our society, with the various institutions that we support with our cooperation. So those are systems like the various bureaucracies of the government, the military, the police, the educational system, and the religious system, etc. And that we participate in these systems in various ways. And of course, business and commerce also make up an important one of these pillars. We participate in this by our consent, which might simply be our passive reception of the system and not going along with it. But it might be more proactive. For example, our economic system that we support by our buying power. Every time that we go out and make purchases, we support a particular pillar that upholds the status quo. The theological view of this is that the Holy Spirit is poured out on all people, that we all have the Spirit of God in us, the priesthood of all believers, that we all have a certain amount of power that God has vested in us to be able to shape the world in concert with God. The principle of power that we see in this social theory, the social view of power, is the reason why we've seen ordinary people successfully stand up to injustice all over the world throughout history and win. And it's because people, when they know that they can break their habit of obedience, their habit of cooperating with the status quo, and that it is within a moral vision to do so, that they can change everything. We can work within the system, including in this electoral season, to speak truth to power. We can advocate for those who are being dehumanized. We've seen this recently with the Haitian community, where I've seen clergy colleagues across the country speaking out in solidarity with the Haitian community as that community has been dehumanized by the Trump campaign. And we've seen churches saying, the Haitian community is our community. These are our neighbors. These are members of our churches. These are esteemed and valued members of our community. And you don't get to dehumanize them. And so both in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of very practical financial support and shows of physical solidarity, showing up at people's house to accompany them to make sure that they are physically safe. We've seen an incredible grassroots of support to ensure that the Haitian community is safe and that their dignity is affirmed and intact. We also saw this just a few weeks ago with the millions of people who petitioned the governor of Missouri to not execute Marcellus Williams. Unfortunately, the governor went ahead with that execution. And the will of the people was very apparent, and the community organizing that went into that is going to continue to build, and the momentum continues to move forward. We can also intervene in instances of injustice. We've seen countless examples of this over the last year, where folks have stepped in to directly stage intervention to the military support of Israel in its bombardment of Gaza. Just this last week, there was a Jewish organized occupation of the stock exchange. You may have seen photos of dozens and dozens of people being arrested, while hundreds, I think some 500 people were protesting at the stock exchange. So that's some of what we can do within the system, imagining within the system. But we can also work outside of the system. So those are some of the ways we can try to shake the pillars of power. We can try to push them down, but we can also try to pull them down by working outside of the system. We can build alternative systems of support. I mentioned churches that are doing mutual aid by relieving people of their debt to free them up to be able to use their resources in other ways. We can build coalitions of power that can actively disrupt existing systems through boycotts, through strikes, and the like. And we can also work to advocate an alternative vision of tomorrow. This is actually one of the most important things as clergy, as Christians, that we can do. Jesus, when he offers his Sermon on the Mount and he shares the Beatitudes, he is offering an alternative vision of the world that could be. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn. These are not the people that the status quo upholds as valuable, that the status quo supports as worthy of care. But within Jesus' vision of the world, These are the folks who are worthy of care, of solidarity, of support. These are the people that God calls blessed. Are continuing to offer an alternative vision to the incredibly violent and constrained visions that our politicians are offering us. And again, I would say these pharaonic visions are present on both sides of the aisle. These limited visions of power are present on both sides of the aisle, and that Christian nationalism offers a very constrained vision of who belongs, right? That's contingent on whiteness. It's contingent on national identity to be a US citizen. It's contingent on being a Christian. And the vision of God in Christ is expansive. It offers an alternative and subversive vision to any imperial violent visions of the future that require the disposability of some people. So we can cast visions that are about bringing hope and direction and unity, that are a counterfront to the visions of white Christian nationalism and other imperial visions of the future. I'm not going to go into all these different pieces of this triangle here. That would be, I've offered a whole class where we go through each of these one by one. But vision is just the first piece of how we offer a strategy to move forward toward an alternative vision of tomorrow, toward the kingdom of God, in concert with Christ, in concert with God and with one another. So vision is where we want to be. A general strategy is what accompanies that. A general strategy is inclusive of nonviolence. That is one of the important components of how we will move toward vision together. And so when we are inviting people into this alternative vision of tomorrow, we can also say to folks, the way that we get there together, the only way we get there together is nonviolently. Because as long as violence is a factor, as long as we in any way see people as disposable, as long as we make monsters of anybody, that vision of tomorrow where everyone belongs will not come to pass, will not come to fruition. Now, in a second, we'll get into how do we deal with those folks? How do we approach those folks? How do we strategically engage with those folks who are actively disposing of people? But our general strategy is inclusive of this nonviolent ethic that insists upon all people being beloved children of God. Below that is our strategy, which is about what do we need to do to meet our goals? What are the strategic objectives that we will need to fulfill? Our campaigns are about putting together extensive linked tactics that are where tactics are the protests as well as the interventions, boycotts, strikes, etc., linking those together to be able to move in concert toward our strategy of nonviolence. And then individual tactics are the ways that we achieve our strategy. So oftentimes, the part of why I shared this image with you, oftentimes what we see is folks starting with tactics and hoping that they will get to a vision of tomorrow, starting with a protest and hoping that that will result in a movement that will go toward everyone belonging, everybody flourishing. And the problem is that it's just too small of a vision. An individual tactic like a protest is not sufficient. It's not in and of itself a strategy. And so we have to begin thinking about what is our vision of tomorrow before we begin planning individual tactics. Oops, skipped one. There we go. I want to talk a little bit about Jesus' strategy. This is not something we necessarily think about as we read the Gospels, But I think Jesus was a very strategic, nonviolent practitioner. In Jesus dealing with his disciples and preparing to send them out into the world, he invites them to consider to whom they are going and what they will do when they get there. In the gospel, according to Matthew, Jesus says to the disciples, "Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals, or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out in it who is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it'll be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town." When Jesus sends his disciples out into a violent imperial world, he knows that they're going to face an incredible amount of resistance. They're going to face tremendous obstacles. And so he prepares them for the risks that they're going to face and for the terrain that they're going out into and the kind of enmity that they will face. And he's encouraging them to go out into that world with open hands and an open heart, to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. And my encouragement to you in this election season and beyond is to do that too, to go out into the world, to go out into your communities, knowing that there is a tremendous amount of enmity, to know the enmity that is out there, to know your enemy, which is white Christian nationalism and the other imperial systems like it, and also to go with an open heart and open hands, ready to be surprised by the people whom God is calling you to encounter. One of the tools that I've found most helpful in social change theory is this spectrum of allies. And it's the idea that there aren't binaries when we're dealing with people, that on any side of an issue, that there are not simply two sides, that you'll find people who are the leading activists promoting, in this case, the kingdom of God, this reign of God where no one is disposable, where all are beloved, where all belong. And you will find your leading opponents who are shouting about those who are scapegoats, who are vilifying, who are disposing of people. But in between, you'll find all kinds of other folks. You'll find people who are active allies. You'll find people who are more passive, but are perhaps persuadable. You'll find a lot of people who are maybe pretty oblivious to the issues at hand, or maybe willfully so. You'll find passive opponents, and you'll find active opponents. And so this idea is to go out with some savvy into your community, trusting that there's people with whom you can actively build coalition and solidarity, and to really invest your energy there, to invest your energy with those people with whom you can build power, those people with whom you can build relationship, those people with whom you can build community. Nonviolent social theory suggests that you only need 3.5% of a population to be able to enact significant social change. And I can say more about that in the Q&A if anybody would like. But the research is that you don't actually need the majority of any population to be able to enact significant revolutionary change. You need people who are willing to act with intervention, courageous intervention amidst the violent status quo. So you do need a committed core of people, but you don't need everybody. And so this is a tool to begin thinking about who are those people who will welcome you into their home? And then who are those people where you may just need to shake the dust off your feet? One last slide before we go ahead with some Q&A. This is one of my favorite images of the prophet Elijah. And I love this moment as it's been captured by this artist from the 19th and 20th century, because he in this moment is going, I'm the only one. It's just me, God. They have killed all the prophets. Jezebel and Ahab, they've gotten rid of every faithful person. They've killed all the prophets, and I'm the only one. And he's in the cave in despair and hopelessness and in desperation, in a posture of isolation and hopelessness. And the answer that comes to Elijah is twofold. First, an angel feeds him, attends him with cake. He is fed and nourished and cared for 40 days in the wilderness. And then the voice of God comes to Elijah and says, there are 1,000 others who are out there, who are faithful, who are contending for me. And one of those is named Elisha. And from this moment of despair and hopelessness and isolation, Elijah goes out and meets Elisha, who becomes his disciple and becomes like a son to him, his dearly beloved son. And so I want you to know that there are deeply internalized imperial myths that we are all prone to. The most powerful of them is that we are alone, that we are isolated, that we are the only ones. And it's simply not true. As powerful as that myth is, and we've seen it literally consume people. Some of you have seen the stories over this last year of people engaging in protest through self-immolation. There have been at least four self-immolations in the US over the last year, people burning themselves alive or attempting to do so in protest of US policy in Palestine. And that protest is one that is coming from a place of deep despair and isolation. And one of our tasks as Christians and as clergy is to remind ourselves, to root ourselves in the truth of our belovedness in God and in the reality that we are never alone. As lost as we might feel in this wilderness, especially in the chaos of this election season with all of the hatred that is getting flung around every which way, and all the ways that we are being rendered disposable, we have to hold on to the truth that we are loved, we are in community, we're in communion with one another, and that the justice of God will prevail. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here. And I know that Leah will be leading us in a time of some question and response.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was incredible. Um, the biblical foundation for this with Shipra and Puah and with Vashti, that just, wow. And then, of course, all of the Jesus examples. There's so much in there that can be used for sermons, for teaching, for pastoral care, for community ministry. That was wonderful. And the illustrations with the pillars of support for power, and all of the other graphics. This was really, really helpful. And I know people are going to be grateful to have this recording to be able to share with other allies as well. At this point, we invite people to put their questions into the Q&A or into the chat. And while we are waiting for people to gather their thoughts, I want to follow up with a question that I'm sure Brianna has one as well. Lauren, you noted, and I've heard this statistic before, that it only takes 3.5% of people to be galvanized to enact social change. So when you do the math on that, like if you have a congregation, say, of 100 people, that means you only need 3.5 of them to start something. And I wonder if you can share an example, maybe from your own ministry or from another congregation that you're aware of, where they started with that mustard seed of 3.5%. And I think that would preach too, the mustard seed of
For sure.
3.5%. and how they got started and what they're doing now, how they grew from there.
Yeah, I love that question. So I want to give a little bit more information about that data. That comes from a longitudinal study of nonviolent movements over the course of the last century by Maria J. Stefan and Erica Chenoweth. And if you want to read more, they've written a whole book about, I think it's called Why Civil Resistance Works. And their discovery was that nonviolent movements are twice as successful as violent movements in achieving democracy and achieving like longitudinal, sustained democratic societies. And so that was true of people overthrowing dictatorships. That was one of the fields of research. And I'm forgetting the other at the moment, but that was the focus. So, it's a bit we're making an analogy to congregations, but I do think that there is a lot to be said for how this can be applied in a congregational context. One of the findings, so the 3.5% rule is that when 3.5% of a population is engaged in sustained nonviolent intervention and non-cooperation, there is not a single example of that movement failing in its goals. Meaning every single movement that achieved that threshold of participation was able to meet its goals of its nonviolent revolutionary goals. Now, non-cooperation, and nonviolent intervention are not protests. Nonviolent intervention and non-cooperation are removals of consent from the system as it stands. And so these are things like boycotts and strikes. Those are the most obvious examples that people are going to be most familiar with. And so